Diana, and all right, welcome. Glad you are here. As Diana mentioned, my name is Sofia Cervantes, and I'm with the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. We are a state advocacy agency, and our agency has been placed and given the role by federal law to provide advocacy support to individuals with developmental disabilities, their families, and to provide support to the systems that support and provide services to individuals with developmental and or intellectual disabilities. And so our office provides what's called technical assistance, which fancy state talk for feel free to give us a call and we can answer your questions. And we also provide trainings for the community on a range of topics. And one of our popular ones is indeed this presentation that you will be hearing today, which is understanding special education evaluations. Okay, so I'd like to start just by letting you know our office conducts a range of topics. We conduct trainings every Monday at 10 a.m. and we do one topic, one date in English, and then the following we do the same topic in Spanish. Right now, January, February, we're beginning with a series on regional center. So if that's of interest to you, please feel free to join us. And just so you know, I think on the chat, Diana will drop a link, or already has placed a link for you to access the materials of today's presentation. And in that same Google Drive, you will see a folder that says SCDD flyers. And so if you click on that, and I'm just going to quickly show that to you so that you know what to expect as you click that link.
Yes, everybody, it's already in the chat. So just look into the chat and you can open that up.
Awesome. So that link will take you to a drive that's titled SCDD 118, Understanding Special Ed Evaluations. And you will see the presentation right here with a star. So if you click on that, you'll see the presentation that I will project on your screen in just a second. And if you go up here to SCDD flyers, you'll see our yearly calendar. So you can see when we have trainings, what dates are in English, what dates are in Spanish. And then if you click on the other one, you'll get more specific information on what topics we will be doing on the dates corresponding to the Regional Center series. Okay, so our next one coming up is January, where are we? 23rd, this coming Monday, and it'll be in Spanish on Regional Center Services and IPP strategy. So feel free to join us for that. Okay, and again, I want to direct you to your materials. Please know that you have several materials that I'll be referring you to throughout the presentation, and know that you have everything here. If in a month you click this link, you will find more things, or you will find these things in here. If during the presentation a question comes up, and that takes me to remember a resource that I should provide you guys, I will post it on here. And by the end of the presentation or tomorrow, you would be able to see that added document here. Okay. Loving this part of technology. It's easy to, kind of share all these things. Since I have you on this.
Oh, Sophia, I was just going to ask, can you let everyone know how you would like to take questions, or if you will be having specific question periods?
Yes, perfect. For the sake of the presentation and the recording, what I will do, if there's a question that's very linked to the section of the presentation that I'm discussing, then I may reference it. I won't mention your name, but I'll just reference it so that it can remain in the recording. But for specific questions and more of a dialogue, we will be taking those at the end of the presentation, and I will do my best to make that happen at around 11:30 so that we can have a good half hour to answer specific questions after. Okay, but again, if there's something that a word you weren't clear on, or something contextually with the slide that I'm on, please feel free, and I'll try to keep my eye on the chat. And Diana, feel free to sort of say, oh, Sophie, what if, and you can kind of ask the question on the chat. Okay.
Thank you. I always do.
Thank you. Yes. I'm still sharing my screen. Yes. Okay, perfect. I just want to direct you to this. It's a resource that you'll see on one of the last slides of the presentation, but I just want to direct you to it. There's a podcast called Understood, which is pretty good. There's others that I provide to you here, but even in a little tip or confession, anytime I'm going to do a presentation as I'm getting ready, putting my face on, I will put kind of a YouTube video or a podcast on the topic that I'm speaking on, just to kind of hear, especially if it's new, whatever. So this is one of the ones I'm listening to. And it's the topic is, what is an evaluation? Evaluations for special education. And they usually have experts on this podcast. And at the end here, if you go to the YouTube version, they direct you to their page. And you can see some resources here. What's an evaluation? Different terms you may hear for evaluations. I thought that was a pretty good resource. Parent Training Centers, a free resource in your state. So just a resource that I want to highlight that's pretty good. And it is sort of a follow through of what we're going to discuss right now. Okay. All right. So let me stop all this now. And I will be sharing my screen now with the presentation. Okay. Perfect. All right. And you all now see the screen with the presentation? Yep.
Yes.
Looking good?
Looking good.
Awesome. All right. So we will be discussing evaluations, how to understand them, and get services for your child in special education. Okay, and again, on this first slide, you see my information. Please feel free to contact us if we can help with anything else. So I want to just mention this presentation is kind of like a part 3. So just so you know, right before we do this presentation, there is a part 1 and 2 that's called IEP strategies, where we talk a lot about what the IEP looks like, sort of how to effectively advocate during an IEP meeting, etc. And so today, I'm kind of taking off from a section of that part 1 and part 2, but going directly just into evaluations. This presentation itself can be a 3-hour presentation if we really went into detail and if we really took questions throughout the presentation. So today I'm going to try to give you as much as I can. And there's some things that I may go through quickly, but know that you could go back to your presentation and read a little bit in more detail what that may be. So here we start by acknowledging that the IEP, this IEP process, it has different steps, right, or different components. So when you have an IEP meeting, usually what will be discussed first is the evaluation, right, or evaluations. Why? Because these evaluations give us what they call PLOPs. The school district will often use the acronym PLOPs, which means present levels of performance. That means the evaluation will give you information on how your student is performing in the present time. And so based on these PLOPs, based on how they performed in this evaluation, you will have a better idea, or your IEP team should have a better idea of what goals and objectives would be appropriate to include in your IEP. Based on this evaluation, the information that they received from the evaluation, also you may discuss accommodations and modifications, right? Based on what information was found about the student, that information may be used to come up with accommodations and modifications that will be written into your IEP document. The evaluations, and based on the present levels of performance, that will help the team then determine what services and supports your student needs in order to meet the goals that were set on the IEP. And then lastly, but very important, is the evaluation sometimes will inform the team of where the student should be in terms of placement. Where should they be learning? Should it be a special day class? Should it be a autism focused class? Should they be mainstream for 60% of the time, and then in a special education class? Will it be moderate to severe, moderate to mild, etc.? So as you can see, evaluations are at the top of all these things that are to follow. And so it is highly important for us to understand what is the evaluation saying, so that I can know what I could expect to hear in the rest of the conversation, and also so that I could prepare to effectively contribute to all these sections of the conversation we're about to have. So evaluations are super important to understand them, right? And this is where the room may have some professionals, some parents, some self-advocates, not sure exactly what role you have in the life of a person with an intellectual or developmental disability, but sometimes a lot of family advocates, a lot of family members, including parents, feel that the evaluation is a little daunting, right? It's got language that you may not recognize very much. It's got numbers. It's got, just terminology that we may not be familiar with, right? And so it's really important to understand what we're looking at in order to know how to advocate during the meeting. Okay, and again, advocate for what? Advocate for what goals should be there, advocate for what accommodations and modifications, advocate for what services and supports and what placement the student will have. Okay, and so it's important to understand the evaluation before the IEP. And with this, let me say, you can request, and we always suggest whenever you're going to request something to do it in writing, but you could always request to receive the evaluation report before the IEP takes place, right? And why? Because when you're in an IEP, you're in conversation, right? You don't have time to go and read and highlight and think about what you're reading. You're already in the meeting, right? And so I want to clarify and point out, I use the word may. You may ask for that evaluation report prior to the IEP, although I want to let you know there's nowhere in statute, in law, where it says that they have to give it to you before. What the law does say, though, is that you are an equal participant of the IEP team. And so we may argue, right, that because you are an equal participant of the IEP meeting, that therefore you should have preview to the same information that everyone else at the table from the school district or the evaluators have. Right. And so using that logic or that argument, you may ask for the team or the evaluator to give you that evaluation report prior to the meeting. And so you might make a written note, which again, we suggest that you always do things in writing, and that you have proof that they received what you sent them. Whether that be, we'll get into this, I believe, a little bit later in the presentation, but whether that be you taking it in person and having a copy so that they can stamp it and sign it, or doing registered mail. Okay, so you would request that they give you that evaluation 5 days before, 3 days before the presentation, something reasonable. And also, just want to clarify, there's nowhere in law where it says they have to give it to you 7 days before, nothing like that. So you, using that logic of, I want to be able to participate in this meeting, which I'm a team player, I'm a team member of this IEP team, I need to know the information before as well. So you can request it, and you can then review that before you go into the IEP. Now, it's important to note, and I guess I'll be saying this all throughout the presentation because we're talking about pretty much the most important things. So it's important to know that the school district has the mandate, has the legal requirement to conduct evaluations every 3 years, right? Which is why some meetings are called the triennial, right? you've got your IEP meetings, and then on that third year, usually they call it the triennial. Why? Because schools conducted evaluations, right? And so the school is required to do it every 3 years. However, you have the right to request them every year. So they're required to do it every 3, but you have the right to request them every year. The school will not likely remind you that you can do it every year. The school will not look for you to do it every year. They'll usually kind of chase you a little bit when they have to do the triennial, when they have to do it because the law says so, right? But you have the right, and it's important for you to know that you have the right to do an evaluation or request an evaluation every year. They can even be done more often if it's in less than a year. If you want it more often within the year, you may request it, but for this one, the school has to agree. If they disagree, then it wouldn't take place. But again, they are required to do it every 3 years. You have the right to request it every year. And if you are requesting it more often, then you can request that from the school, and the school would have to agree in order to do it more often than just once a year. Okay. And again, when you're requesting anything, really request it in writing. And the reason why we emphasize this is that I'm assuming most of you will be familiar with due process. Due process, we cover this in part 1 of this IEP, strategies, but due process is a legal process that a family can go through or the school can initiate, but it is a process, a legal process where the school and the family present themselves before a hearing judge, and the judge determines who is right about whatever the disagreement was. So due process is something that the family can file when there is a disagreement with the school. Right? You have been in the IEP meetings, you have evaluations, and you are requesting for more speech. The school says no. If there is a disagreement, this is where the family may request a due process. And sometimes really it's the only way to kind of get some movement. Because if the school says no, then it's no, but you have the right to go into a due process, which usually does, not usually, it does require a lawyer. And because you may be in a due process situation, we encourage that you always have things in writing so that if and when you go to a due process, you have things to demonstrate what has happened throughout the months or throughout the years. Okay, just a little point on the side, keep in mind, due process can be filed for any disagreements within the past 2 years. Okay, so if there is an issue that you've been in disagreement with within the past 2 years, you can file for due process. Okay. All right. So evaluations, as we mentioned, they are required to be done every 3 years, but you can request them every year. And there are many requirements for conducting an evaluation, many requirements that the school has to follow when they're doing an evaluation. And let me quickly, pardon me for lowering my screen. Let me quickly take you to did you see my screen change to the Google Drive folder?
Yes, we did.
Okay, perfect. So if you go here to legally required elements for LEA evaluations, you will see a list with the section of the law where this is discussed of the different requirements for an evaluation. We won't go through all of them, but know that you have that in the Google Drive to review on your own. Okay, so assisting in determining information related to the student's involvement and progress in the general education curriculum is one requirement. Does not use any single measure or criterion. These are all different requirements based on the law about special education evaluations. Okay, so please know that that is there in your Google Drive. And Please also know that earlier we talked about accommodations and modifications. You have a pretty lengthy document here that discusses some examples of modifications and accommodations. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, now know that when evaluations are being conducted, they are usually conducted, and we're usually going to find out one of two things. Evaluations are conducted for diagnostic purposes at the very beginning when a student does not have special education services yet, and the family wants to determine if they are eligible for special education. Usually that process begins with an evaluation, right? An evaluation is required to be able to diagnose or determine whether they indeed are eligible for services. That's one reason for an evaluation. Number two is usually they're looking for progress, right? We're providing a service and the evaluation should reflect whether there's progress or not in the area that's being worked on, right? And so evaluations will be conducted for one of those two reasons, okay? Now, know that by law, evaluations should be conducted in any area of disability and any area of suspected disability, okay? So either areas of where they demonstrate disability already or areas where there is suspected disability. An evaluation is appropriate so that we could explore if indeed there are some challenges that are stopping or limiting the student from making academic progress, and that evaluation report should indicate whether they need or what services and supports they need to be able to meet their goals and to be able to benefit from their academics, okay? So evaluation results should inform us about what services the person needs. And when we say what services they need, that includes the frequency. So how often, how much, the quantity, how long, the method, and the type of service. Okay, so will it be occupational therapy or speech and language, right? Will it be frequency? Would be, is it going to be every week, every month, every day? What is the frequency? Okay, and how much every day for 20 minutes? Okay, for the next year, for the next 2 years, whatever that may be. So the evaluation results should give information to determine services, including the frequency, quantity, duration, method, and type. They also may indicate placement, right? We talked about this a little bit earlier. Where is the student going to learn best, right? Will it be a SDC class, right? A special day class? Will it be an autism focused, special education, mainstream, etc.? Evaluation should let us know these things. Evaluations should also inform us about what other treatments or methodologies should be used with this student, okay? This might include, if they need speech and language, do they need it in an individual basis, or will they benefit from doing it speech and language in a group setting, right? So that the evaluation may give us some indication of what is going to be the most appropriate method, strategy, okay? Evaluation reports may also inform us about a specific diagnosis and the severity of it. Okay, and when we say severity, what we mean by that is how much need do they have within this area, right? There usually is an identified problem area, right? And if we have a problem area, we know they've got some challenges. Now let's find out how much of a challenge do they have. And why is that important? Because how much of a challenge they have will probably also determine how much or how many services and supports they need. What would make logical sense, right, is that if your son or daughter or a student has a lot of challenge, they are very severe in this use of the word, if they've got a lot of challenge, then it would logically make sense that they're probably going to need more support than someone who has less challenges, right? And so to sort of dive into this concept, I'm displaying what we call a bell curve on your screen, okay? And a bell curve is something that we can use to understand where our student is testing. Where do they fall when they do an evaluation? Where do the results fall in this bell curve, right? And for a second, let me sort of put special education on the side, and let's just look at this bell curve using a non-special education related example, okay? So a bell curve helps us understand a phenomenon, right? For whatever topic, we want to know, where do most of the population, where does it lie? And then we see that the curve starts to kind of taper off on both sides, right? So the majority of people fall here, and then there's some that fall below, and there's some that are deficient. There is some that, contrary, on the other side, they fall above or superior. So let's think about this bell curve explains to us the height of the population. So let's be more specific. Let's say this bell curve explains to us the height of women, okay? So this graph would tell us, or this bell curve would tell us, the majority of women, and feel free to open your mic if you would, or type on the chat. What would you say is the average height for a woman, an adult woman? What would you all say? What's sort of that average range? Give you a
5'4",
second.
5'4",
5'4", 5'4" to what? Sorry,
5 to 7.
5'4" to 5'7". Yeah. Anybody else? It's pretty accurate, right? 5'4" to about 5'7". So what this bell curve would tell us is right here where you see a 16%, that's where you would put your 5'4". And then right here where you see 84%, that's where you would place your 5'7". So what this bell curve is telling us is the majority of women in height, they range from 5'4" to 5'7". However, there are some women who are less than 5'4", right? Their height is less, below 5'4". My mother included. My mom, I believe, is 5'1". She's a cute little lady, right? So she would be, we would say below average would be maybe 5'3" to maybe 4'9", right? That's pretty below average. Now, there are some women in our population that may even have the condition of dwarfism, right? So anything below 4'9" would be way below average, even reaching the point of dwarfism, which is a condition, right? So we're saying the majority range from 5'4" to 5'7", but there are those women that are, their height is less, and then there are some that are way less, even to the condition of dwarfism. Then on the other side of the bell curve, we have the idea then that there are women that are taller than 5'7". Okay, they are above average. So let's say 5'7" to 6'2". I have a friend who is, I believe, 6. Right, and every time I go, I feel so tiny. I'm 5'5", I believe. I forget. I'm 5'5", so I see her and I'm like, friend. She gives me a hug and it's great, right? So she is above average, right? So let's say any woman 5'7" to 6'3", right, would be above average. These are probably your basketball players, right? Your runners, your athletes, they are above average and they have that advantage. And then there are some that are superior, even reaching the condition of, for some reason, I know this term more in Spanish than in English, but you're the individuals who are like giants, right? And it's an actual condition. So you have a curve, you have a bell curve describing women, the average measure within this amount. And then there are some that are shorter and some that are way shorter. And then there are some that are taller and then some that are way, way taller. We call those outliers, right? There's not many of them, but there are some. So with this, now transferring this to special education, what we're saying here with this graph is when your son or daughter or the student that you're serving has an evaluation done, the goal of the evaluation is to figure out where do they fall in this bell curve. Now, let me already say, you're not often, I don't know if ever, you're not often at least gonna find that the school will give you this pretty graph, right? I think it's pretty, right? And it makes a lot of sense, and I can easily determine that. They're not. The report is gonna have numbers. So one of your first questions is going to be to determine how the scores are reported. So if you see this image here, you see that there are standard scores, there are subtest scores, T-scores, Z-scores, and then here at the bottom are percentages. So the school may report the evaluation numbers in percentages, in standard scores, in subtest scores, in T-scores, or Z-scores, right? So let me switch over to this one here. This is called the conversion table, right? So it helps you to know, question number one, in what type of numbers is the evaluation report reporting in, if that makes sense, right? So if they are in standard scores, then it might be helpful to convert it, right? If it's a standard score, in subtest scores, that would mean a 19. In a percentile rank, that would mean a 99. Let me explain this further. So this is like when we're saying, this is where a lot of kids, me, get tricked when they're young, right? Do you want $1? $1. Look, it's one piece of paper. Or do you want 4? Or do you want 3 quarters, right? Look, you're getting 3 things and not 1, right? This is conversion. $1 equals 4 quarters, or 10 dimes, or 20 nickels, or 100 pennies, right? So this, imagine that in this language, right? So a percentage score of 50% is the equivalent to 100 in a standard score, which is equivalent to a 10 in a subtest score, and equivalent to a 50 in a T-score, and equivalent to a 0 in a Z score. Okay, so all this is numbers being reported in different categories, just like you can report money in different categories of dollars, quarters, dimes, cents, etc. Okay, makes sense? Hope that does. So again, when you're doing an evaluation, you're wanting to find out, where does the evaluation indicate that my son or daughter lies in this bell curve, right? So where does the evaluation say that my son or daughter, what is their present level of performance? Remember, we mentioned plops. What is their present level of performance? And so this is then going to help me figure out, one, do I agree with where they say my son or daughter is in this bell curve? And 2, do I agree with the services that they're recommending based on where my son or daughter is? So let me discuss that just a little bit more. So if they say, if you look and your son or daughter had an evaluation for their speech, some kind of communication evaluation, and they discovered that your son or daughter falls within this 25% range or a 90 in standard score. Okay. What is your guess? Excuse me. Will the school suggest or recommend that your son or daughter needs services? Yes or no? And I'll give this a second. Please feel free to put it on the chat. I'm curious, right, just to make sure that we're following the information. If they say that your son or daughter is at a 25 percentile or 90 in a standard score, do you think that the school is gonna give you services? Yes or no? No. Okay, one person put no. Anyone else? Anyone else have a thought on that? No. Perfect. You're correct. No. And why? Because they're within the average. What the test is saying is they're performing like the average student. So no. If they test below average, then you probably could expect that they would give some services. And if they test within the deficient, then you can expect that they would get probably more services. So it ends up looking something like this. If your son or daughter tests anywhere between this 16 percentile or 85 and above, that means they tested either within the average or even better. So the school would likely not offer any services. Again, why? Because why would they? They're testing within the average, where someone usually without a disability, where they usually test. Now, again, if they test below average, you could expect that you will see some services. And if they test within the deficient range, you should expect that that person should be receiving more services. Okay, now, again, question number one for you when you're looking at your evaluation report. Just so you know, I've given you copies of blank bell curves in case you'd like to use them to kind of graph the results of your son or daughter. And then you can compare it to this chart here to know what to expect in that meeting. So again, if your son or daughter tested at this 25 percentile, I should already know two questions, the answer to two questions. One, do I think this is accurate, right? Is this accurate? Do I think my son is within the average? Let me ask you, if your son is nonverbal and doesn't have currently a method, an alternative method of communication, is it logical? Do you agree that your son indeed fell within this 25 percentile? Probably your answer is no. Some individuals, maybe you are one of those, look at their evaluation report and say, who is this kid? Because it's not mine, right? They're reading all these things that the student can do, and you're saying, I have no idea whose report they gave me because that's not my son. In that case, and we're going to get into independent evaluations in just a little bit, when a parent is not in agreement with the evaluation that the school did, that is when the parent can say, I disagree with this evaluation that the school did, and I am requesting an independent educational evaluation. And that's usually referred to as an IEE, or an independent evaluation. Take note that the school will always be the first one to perform the evaluation. If and when the parent disagrees, then that is when an IEE, or an independent evaluation, can be requested. Okay, but the school will always do theirs. But again, let's say you get the report and you're saying, I do not agree with what this says. Then you may request an independent evaluation. Okay, that's scenario one. Now, a different scenario might be, wow, okay, my son tested, or the evaluation report is reporting that my son or daughter is within this 5% or this 5%, this percentile. So let's say you say, you know, sounds pretty accurate, right? I agree. I think my son is in that level. However, then you go to the recommendations section of the report, and you find that the evaluation report says that the recommendation is 0 services. When that occurs, we refer to that as it is the document, the report is internally inconsistent. Okay, and I'm going to type that in the chat just in case. Internally inconsistent. Inconsistent. I almost wrote it in Spanish. Okay, so why? Because if the report is identifying that indeed your son is below average, that your daughter is below average, and they're saying, but we're recommending no services, does that make sense? No, right? Because how are they going to make progress if no intervention is being provided, right? Or let's say your son, actually, let's use a standard score. Your son tested 30 using a standard score. Okay, if you notice here, they're going by 10 points. So 70, 60, 50, 40, extend the graph, 40, 30. They are way below average. And what if the school is saying, we recommend 5 minutes of speech and language? Does that make sense? You're probably answering, not really, right? If they are way below, they probably need more than those 5 minutes. So there are 2 things for you to ask yourself when you're reading the evaluation is, again, 1, do you agree with where it places your child? Are they testing? Did they test within the average, below the average, or how below the average? Number 1. And 2, do you think, or do you agree, I should say, with the recommendation for services and supports based on where your son or daughter tested? Excuse me. So that is the importance of understanding the evaluation before you even get in the door of the IEP meeting. I want to know, do I agree with where they are reporting that my son lies on this bell curve? And 2, do I agree with the services and supports that are being suggested based on where they tested? And perhaps 3, am I going to request an independent evaluation? Okay, those are pretty much the questions that you would want to know before the IEP. Okay, all right. And as we said, we're going to be taking questions at the end. I myself am fighting from asking you if you have any questions so that we can go through it and then we can answer some questions. Here you'll see, this is just a tool if you want to use it. You don't have to, but this is a tool so that if, let's say, your son or daughter got tested in several areas, you can just graph it. This is the equivalent of this chart, but it's right here. Right? So imagine the bell curve right here. Okay. So let's say your son tested 68 for speech and language, and then they tested him for something else and he tested at 90. You're going to graph it here just to give yourself a full picture of where your son is in all the areas where he or she was tested. Okay, you'll see you'll imagine, you could even draw the bell curve over this document and you'll be able to graph and identify whether they are within the average, above the average, or below the average. Okay, I'm going to skip through this a little bit, but this gives you some examples of what you might be looking at. And think of what kind of services would a person that tests with this, these scores, what they should be receiving. Okay, so if we see here, We have a person whose IQ is 101. Their verbal comprehension is 124. And yet their perceptual reasoning is 88. Their working memory is 110, and their processing speed is 75. So we see here the lowest score that this person got is 75. Okay, processing speed, which means maybe in accommodations, they may need more time when they're taking a test because it takes them a little longer to process information, right? So this is the way that evaluation scores and reports help us to come up with what modifications, what services, what supports that student needs, okay? This is an example of another person. We can see here that this person's verbal comprehension is at 70, okay? And then their processing speed is 44, and their perceptual reasoning is 46. So you just get an idea of different students here, okay? All right. So we've reviewed what an evaluation is, sort of how to understand it, how to understand what numbers you're looking at, and what questions you might need to answer or ask yourself before. So now we're going to go into more of a technical part of this presentation so that you know what to expect when you request an evaluation, what's the timeline, right? By law, by law, the school has certain time frames, times by which they have to do certain things. When they don't abide, when they don't comply with these timelines, they are out of compliance. If that happens, you actually have the choice of filing what's called a state compliance complaint. That is any time that they are violating the IEP or anytime that they are not following the law, including the timeline or the time frames that the law gives them for doing certain things. So starting with this sort of timeline, whenever you ask for an evaluation, and that's why we encourage you to do it in writing, the school must send you an assessment plan within 15 calendar days of when you request an evaluation. So again, if you request it by phone or in person, when you see them walking, at the school, you'll have no proof of when the clock started for these 15 days. So this is where we hear a lot of parents say, well, I requested an evaluation and then COVID happened and now I realize it's been 2 years and they never did it, right? If you don't have anything in writing, then it's going to be hard to even do a complaint, right? Because there's no proof that they have violated the 15-day timeline, okay? So the school must send you an assessment plan within 15 calendar days. And let me just point out, whenever the law talks about days, it is usually calendar days unless it says otherwise. And calendar days are any days, including weekends, holidays, don't matter, right? Any day on the calendar. If it says business days, obviously it's Monday through Friday and may not include some holidays. So you request an evaluation, and they must give you an assessment plan within 15 days of when you requested the evaluation, okay? Now, the assessment plan must be in a language you understand unless it's not feasible, okay? And not feasible would be just like you may speak Spanish, but there are some individuals who have like a tribal Spanish, right? Or they have a dialect, or they have, so if that is not feasible, then there might be more discussion about that, but it must be in the language that you understand. And again, they have 15 calendar days to give you an assessment plan. After they give you the assessment plan, okay, let's say they did it within 7 days of your request. Now you have 15 calendar days to give it back to them, to consent and sign and give it back to them, okay? The district can make this longer. They may tell you, give it to us within 30 days or whatever, but be careful because the law says that it's at least 15 days. They have to give you at least 15 days to return it. Okay. Now, sometimes if you don't respond within 15 calendar days, the school assumes that your answer is no. And that's when they may come back to the family and say, oh, well, we didn't evaluate because you didn't give us consent, and we can't evaluate your son or daughter without consent, right? So make sure that in your mind, you have this timeline, right? I requested it on January 3rd, okay? And they gave it to me January 10th. Okay, that's within the 15 days. Now I have 15 days to return it. Okay, then from the day that the school receives your consent, they now have 60 days to do the evaluation and to have the IEP team meeting to discuss the evaluation. Okay, and if indeed you are consenting to do an evaluation, you must make sure that your child is available for the evaluation. Okay, you may give consent, but then if they don't go to school for the next 20 days or whatever it may be, there may be some conflict there. Okay, this is sort of a brief timeline of what you could expect. So again, day one, you request it. They have 15 days to give you an assessment plan. You then have 15 days to give it back to them. And then after they receive your signed assessment plan, then they now have 60 days to do the evaluation and to hold the meeting. Okay. Now, if there is a break, a school break, a vacation break of more than 5 calendar days, then the clock stops. Okay, so let me explain that. Let me go back here. So let's say you requested it, they gave it to you within 15 days, you then signed it, and now they have 60 days. But let's say at the 20th day of this 60-day time frame, at the 20th day, let's say it's summer break. And summer break is usually what? A month and a half, 2 months? So those days that they're on break, if it's more than 5 days of break, those days don't count. So what happens there is you can make a note and say, we stopped at day 20 and then they went on vacation. So when they come back on vacation, you start at day 20. Okay, so now they only have 40 days. Okay, so again, vacation more than 5 calendar days are not counted. Okay, so if you request an evaluation right before the summer break, you might find that, of course, that's going to be delayed because you're going to have the whole vacation time in the middle. Now, if you do it at a reasonable time, and meaning reasonable time, meaning not right before a break, and they go over the days, it's been 70 days, and they haven't done the IEP meeting, or they haven't even evaluated your son, which, wow, that would be a lot, right? Which it did happen during COVID and all of that. So what can you do? What we discussed, a state compliance complaint. Okay, and actually I didn't put that on your Google Drive, but I'll be happy to load that onto your drive. Let me make a note of that. Okay, so you can file a state compliance complaint if they violated or they didn't follow that. Okay, evaluations. Now we're gonna talk a little bit about requirements of evaluations. Okay, evaluation materials and procedures must be free of racial, cultural, and sexual discrimination. Okay, you may want to ask the school what evaluation was conducted. There are different ways. We have Google now, so you could Google that evaluation, or there is a book called the Special Educator's Comprehensive Guide to 301 Diagnostic Tests. I think you can see it here. Nope, there you go. Okay, so this book, and I can put a picture of it on the Google Drive if you'd like. So this book might be something that you'd want to invest or search it online just to see what evaluation they're doing and what requirements might be within that evaluation. Okay, now the evaluation must be presented in the student's native language unless clearly not feasible. So the student speaks Spanish, if they speak Cantonese, if they speak Tagalog, right? The evaluation must be presented in the student's native language. Now, something to consider, and some may consider it a far stretch, but something for you to think about. If your son is nonverbal, and their method of communication, their language, their language is PECS. PECS is picture exchange communication, where they use images, right, to communicate. You may identify, if this is the way that they communicate, you may identify for the evaluator and for the school, my son's language is PECS. The evaluation needs to be conducted using that method of communication. Okay, that may be something that you request, or it may be something that you later say, I expressed that my son's method of communication is using PECS. And when I looked, or they reported of how they did the evaluation, they didn't use that. Therefore, they violated the requirement of the evaluation to do it in the child's language. Okay, so it might seem a little bit tangled, the argument, but it indeed may be something that caused the student to not test well or not perform their skill in the way that they would have if they would have done it in their language. Because again, if a child's primary language is Spanish and they evaluate in English, then we're really testing the wrong thing. Right? The person is not performing at the level of their competence, but rather there's a limitation because it's presented in the wrong language. Okay, so that may be something to bring up with the school, or a detail, if you would, to save in your back pocket. And if you go to a due process in the future, that may be something that you bring up. Okay. Now, another requirement is the evaluation must include relevant functional, developmental, and academic information. They must test them in all these areas. Functional, right? What should they be doing based on what grade they're in, based on what their skills should be by the time that they are tested. Developmental, where should they be performing developmentally? If it's speech, then usually by age 6, right? You can look at what developmentally we could expect from a 6-year-old in terms of language, and then compare it to what your son or daughter is performing, right? What level are they performing at? And academic, right? How are they performing academically in comparison to their peers? Okay, so they must include relevant functional, developmental, and academic information. They must be used, the evaluations must be used to measure things for which the evaluation is valid and reliable. Okay, so in that, we must take into consideration they must be using a current version of the evaluation. Let's say you discover that they are going to be using an evaluation called McCarthy's Scale of Children's Abilities. I'm looking at my book, right? But let's say this version is from 2005 and there's been a lot of updates to this evaluation, and you discover that they used a later version than the most updated one. Then that may be a point that takes away the validity or reliability of that evaluation. Okay, and you might want to ask, does it truly measure what it's supposed to measure? Did they even use the correct evaluation tool to test what we're supposed to be looking at? And are the results consistent over time? Because of this, some children get evaluated over a span of several days, sometimes over a span of different settings, right? Outside in a classroom, in another room that's not their classroom, to see how they perform. And because sometimes if you evaluate a child within 15 minutes of their day, maybe that's the best time of their day. But if you would have tested them in the morning, you would have had a different result, right? So the evaluation should account for those differences. All instruments, it's important to identify, all instruments are not created equally, okay, are not created equal. Child's qualities inform the test selection, meaning based on your child's needs, skills, limitations, or challenges, they should choose a tool that matches how your son or child is, right? They're not created equal. So is a person nonverbal? There's a nonverbal cognitive test for children with autism, okay? Versus a test that might be an untimed test for kids with ADHD, etc. So based on their needs, they should be looking for that tool that sort of matches that, okay? The evaluation must be conducted by trained and knowledgeable people, okay? So the person conducting the evaluation should be trained on how to do this specific assessment, okay? They must have experience in evaluating students with disabilities, meaning they must have their licenses up to date. Their licensure should be up to date, okay? So one thing that you could do is there's a website called dca.ca.gov, and I'm going to it right now. It's projecting on your screen, I hope. Give me 1 second. Let me just show you. And what this is this site allows you to look up different professionals to discover if their license is up to date, okay? This is looking a little different. Give me 1 second. So I can give this to you and show you. And I may have to leave it for our question time so that I don't take too much of our time here. Okay, give me 1 second as I lower this. Okay, the site is looking a little bit different. So I'll make sure to put that on the chat or get that for you. But what this is this site allows you to look up the different professionals and type in their name, and it would tell you their license if it's up to date. So this is something that you may want to use to be able to discover if there was any kind of violation there. Excuse me as I find our place. Okay, so it's a license verification. If you find that the person who did your son's evaluation hasn't renewed their license, then they shouldn't have even been the ones conducting the evaluation, okay? So you might want to look at that. All right, the evaluations, they must follow the directions given by the testing manufacturer, okay? For example, testing for emotional or intellectual functioning must be done by a credentialed school psychologist. So let's say you find out, right, that a speech and language therapist was the one to do the emotional or intellectual functioning evaluation. That wouldn't be according to the requirements. It wouldn't match, okay? And they must be standardized the same way each time. The reason why there's manuals pretty much for evaluations is those results should be, or the way that it's conducted should be not they shouldn't be subjective, right? You should be able to get the same answer all the times that you do it. And so with evaluations, that is taken into account. Okay, so they must be standardized. They may be producing the same results each time. They may be conducted in the same way to get the information that is needed. Okay, it must assess specific areas of need. They must accurately measure what it's trying to measure. Okay, so again, if it's speech and language, if it's trying to discover what language the person has, then it must indeed be testing for that. Okay. Now, there are evaluations. Again, we talked about this concept of evaluations take you to sometimes discover what placement should my son or daughter be in, right? And so with this, we come at this concept of least restrictive environment. And there's evaluation findings that should discuss the environmental impact on their learning, which means there are evaluations that should demonstrate what will be the least restrictive environment. And when we talk about least restrictive, we talk about what is the setting that will look the most like the setting where a person without a disability, a student without a disability, is learning, right? What is going to be the least restrictive? For some children, it may not be a special education classroom. That may not be the least restrictive environment. For them, it may be a special day class. It may be a classroom that has less children. So these evaluations should also give information on what environment is going to be the most impactful for that person's education, meaning what is going to be the least restrictive environment. Okay. The evaluations must evaluate all educational needs impacted by the suspected disability, okay, including and not limited to, so these next slides will demonstrate a few. Excuse me. So again, the evaluation must evaluate all educational needs impacted by the disability or suspected, including these. Okay, speech and language, self-help, which includes some independent skills, social, emotional, behavioral, motor, which includes movement, coordination, academic, cognitive, vision, hearing, career and development if they are reaching that transition age, health, developmental or medical, orientation, and mobility. Okay, so these are some of the general areas where you may find that they may need assessment or evaluation based on their disability or suspected disability. When we talk about suspected disability, let me add here, for example, let's say that your son has never had an emotional-based evaluation, okay? However, during the pandemic, you saw them develop some anxiety. You are noticing some depressive symptoms in your son or daughter. And so now there is a suspected disability in that emotional area. And so if there's a suspected disability, then you may request for that area to be explored. Let's say your son is 6 and their language has been developing according to their age developmentally. And now, though, you find that when they were 6, they were where they were supposed to be in terms of language. Now they're 12, and you're saying, boy, I think something's happening with their either cognitive abilities or maybe it's their vision. I see them kind of not being able to understand because they're squinting. So now there's a suspected disability. And so now there may be evaluations in these new areas of suspected disability. Okay. And we are reaching sort of the end of our time, and we're going to be able to take questions and answers in just a little bit. Okay. So the evaluation must use all the data, okay, including information provided by the parents. So very often there is forms in the evaluation that should be given to parents so that parents are able to report their observations of their child's performance or skill level, behavior, etc. Okay, so the evaluation should include information provided by the parents. Okay, and with evaluations, we can run into this objective and subjective component. So we want to make sure that that evaluation tool is accounting for that. It's ruling out the fact that it could be subjective, right? We want the evaluation that if this evaluator did the evaluation and then another one does it, it should have the same results, right? If it was conducted appropriately. Okay, so an example would be if an evaluation is going to track behaviors and attitudes using daily communication sheets. Okay, so that might be something that might give us some subjective answers, right? It may not give us, each teacher may report things differently, each evaluator may find themselves reporting different things. Okay, so present levels of achievement. Remember, we talked about the PLOPs. This is at present levels of academic achievement. This is present levels, but specific to academic achievement. And so the evaluation is hoping to explore that area, okay? So the evaluations are to discover if the student needs or continues to need special education. These are the things that the evaluation wants to discover. And if additions, accommodations, or modifications are needed to meet the goals in the IEP or to be in a general education class. So again, the evaluation process, it's wanting to provide information on where are they lying in that bell curve, and are modifications or accommodations needed, or can it give us information based on the placement of a student? Okay. During the IEP meeting, where you will discuss the evaluation report, all of your questions should be answered. Okay. The meeting isn't over if you still have questions. So do know that that meeting, you are a team member, you are a member of that IEP team, so you have the right to ask any questions that you have. Okay, in part 1 and 2 we discussed this, but in case you're not aware of this detail, know that you can record your IEP meetings as long as you give them 24-hour notice. Okay, so this is a great thing for you to consider to do. And again, we suggest that you let them know in writing that you will be recording the meeting. But all of your questions should be answered. And what better to remember all the information that was discussed during sometimes a very long IEP meeting? Recording. Recording can help you go back and listen to all those questions that you asked and what answers were given. Because truly, those meetings are sometimes very long and it's hard to remember everything that is said, right? So you have the right to record that meeting. And again, you have the right to ask all the questions that you have. If you still have some, then your IEP meeting may not be over and may need to continue, okay? And again, you have the right to that because you are an equal participant of that IEP team. If the school knows something, if the evaluator understands what's happening and you don't, you have the right to ask all those questions, okay? Ideally, you should meet with the person who evaluated, right? With the evaluator, they should be at that meeting. You should be told what the evaluation will include, okay? So let's say you end up requesting an evaluation or an independent evaluation. You want to be able to ask that evaluator, hey, will my evaluation include recommendations? Because sometimes the evaluator may demonstrate where they tested, but may not include recommendations. So you may have to be proactive about that and say, hey, does it include, does your report, will it include recommendations that might be needed? Who administered the evaluation? You can ask that. Does the testing manufacturer allow this test to be administered in other languages? There might be tests that are not allowed to be conducted in other languages. Is that the case with yours? And was it conducted in a different language? So did it violate the requirements of the evaluation? All those questions might be good for you to know, especially if you're in disagreement with that evaluation. And if you want to go to a due process and demonstrate, hey, they evaluated my son, but not according to requirements. Okay. What does it mean when it says informally administered? Sometimes they'll say it was informally administered. What does that mean exactly? Being that there are specific evaluations with specific instructions. So what does it mean if you say, right, that it was informally administered? That might not be following the requirements. Okay. They may say that the teacher administered the evaluation. For many reasons, that may be a big no-no. They may not have the credentials needed for that evaluation. Remember, we said they have to be experienced. Okay, so they may not be the experienced person for that. Okay. If the evaluation says, compared to his peers, this student, blah, 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 fill in the blank, you may want to ask, who are the peers? Are we talking about peers without disabilities of his same age? Are we talking about peers, meaning those in his special education classroom, but who have different needs? Who really are his peers? Okay. You may want to ask, why do I see contradictory information in the evaluation? In one section, you said that he doesn't have a skill in this area, while in the other section, you mentioned that he performed above average. Why is there internal inconsistencies? Okay. Other questions, and I may skip through some of this, but other questions may be related. For the evaluator, did you observe my child? When? Where? What was he or she doing? Okay, how do the test results relate to the least restrictive environment? Those are all questions that you may want to ask. Okay, you can identify, and sometimes you can ask for evaluations to be conducted in sub areas. So for example, communication is a very broad category of skill, because in communication, you have receptive communication, expressive, right? You've got the pragmatics of language and communication. You've got the processing of information, the comprehension piece. So you may want to explore what subcategories of this general category should and could my son or daughter be evaluated in. Okay. Do know that the evaluator gets to choose what test they perform. So you may identify the disability area or the area of suspected disability. However, they, as the expert of that area, do get to choose what tool they're going to use. And that's why you want to make sure that you ask questions to discover whether indeed it was appropriate, it was conducted appropriately, etc. Okay, now they are the experts for that issue, and so they get to choose. However, if when you are presented information, you find that you do not agree, right, with the information that was provided, then again, know that you have the right to get an IEE, an independent educational evaluation. Okay, and again, you have the right, it's like a second opinion. You must disagree with the school's evaluation, though. If you are going to request an independent evaluation, then you must first disagree with the one of the school, and then know that the school district only has two options. When you request an independent evaluation, they could either, one, say yes, we're gonna pay for that independent evaluation, But if they say no, then that means they are taking you to due process. They must either take you to due process to argue that their evaluation is correct, or they must fund the independent evaluation. Okay, this is really important because if you ask for an independent evaluation and they say no, sometimes parents get tricked into going to due process because they were denied an independent evaluation. That is not the case, because the school should either be the one to initiate the due process, or they say yes and they give you the independent evaluation. You don't have to do a due process if they deny you an IEE. Okay, the reason why this is important is whoever initiates a due process has what's called the burden of proof. So you don't want to initiate a due process and have the burden of proof if it is them who should be initiating that due process. Okay, so again, they do an evaluation first. If you disagree, you may ask for an independent evaluation, first stating that you indeed disagree with the evaluation, the school's evaluation. You request an independent evaluation, and the school has only two options. They either say yes, you can do the independent evaluation, or they say nope, we're taking you to due process. And what that would mean is they're going to argue in due process of why they're going to defend their evaluation, why this is an accurate evaluation. Okay. When choosing the evaluator, so you now have the choice to choose the independent evaluator. When choosing the evaluator, make sure that they agree to attend the meeting. Right? If they're going to do an evaluation, but aren't going to present their report at the IEP, you may not want to hire them to do the evaluation. Okay. Make sure that they agree to include recommendations for goals, accommodations, modifications, services, and placement as appropriate. Okay. If you pay for your IEE, let's say you, before the IEP, let's say you had an evaluation done by your medical insurance. This was before he even got evaluated by the school. If you have this IEE, one suggestion would be to hold on to this IEE, okay? If you disagree with the school's evaluation and you request an independent evaluation and they say, yes, we're gonna do it, then you may present this evaluation that you had done independently through your insurance. You may present it. If that evaluation is used, then they would have to reimburse you for what you paid for that evaluation you had done before. Why? Because of the law FAPE, Free Appropriate Public Education. If there is something that is used for the child's education and you paid for it, because it's supposed to be free appropriate public education, they must reimburse you that cost. Okay, so you may do that. And when all things considered, any violations, any non-compliance with providing what's on the IEP, etc., you get to do a state compliance complaint if they are violating the law, not following the IEP, or breaking not breaking your rights, but violating your rights. So breaking the law, not complying with the IEP, or not complying with the timelines or your rights. Okay. Some things to remember as we come to a close: always put your requests in writing. Okay. Make sure that you either have proof that they signed it or they stamp it, or you send it through registered or certified mail, where they give you a little card back and it has a signature of who received your document. Remember that this helps you prove that they indeed received a request from you. And if they didn't follow the timeline that the law says, then you're able to prove that they violated that requirement. If you have a date of when that was received, and then you say, well, they haven't done it yet, they're in violation. I requested it in April or in January, and it's already June, right? It's been way beyond the 60 days. You also may not want to wait that long to file it, right? After the 60 days, you may want to reasonably, after the 60 days, you may want to do that, okay? Other things to consider: clearly voice your disagreements at the IEP, okay? If you're in disagreement, clearly state that you're in disagreement. We covered this in part 1, so we may not have reviewed this in this presentation, but keep in mind when we are discussing our child's needs and our services, we're talking about appropriate education, not optimal. And the difference there is, it may sound like a play on words, and it kind of is, but you never want to say the best thing for my son is for him to have a one-on-one. You want to cancel that vocabulary or that word from your vocabulary. Do not use the word best or optimal. We want to get used to using the word appropriate. A one-on-one is appropriate for my son based on his needs. The reason why that's so important is because the law doesn't say that your son or daughter is entitled to the best education. I know it sounds like a little game, but the law doesn't say your son is entitled to the best education. They have the right to a free, appropriate public education. So you want to use the same language that the law uses, okay? 20 minutes of speech and language is appropriate for my son. The minute that we say that's the best, then you are not going to get that, right? Because they're not required to give you the best. So in your evaluation reports, you want to make sure that the evaluator has not put those words on there, right? And that's why oftentimes the report in the IEP is considered a draft, because you're going to discuss it in the IEP meeting and you can make changes and suggest those changes, right? So I noticed that right here, it says 20 minutes of speech and language would be the best service or whatever for this student, right? Can we change that to appropriate? That is appropriate for his needs, not the best, right? But it's appropriate. So keep language in mind. Keep in mind that you do not have to sign the IEP immediately after the meeting. The law says signing it within a reasonable amount of time. A lot is discussed during the meeting. You may not be able to really filter through everything that was said, so you may want to take some time, reasonable amount of time, review everything, listen to your recording, right? Because hopefully you recorded your meeting and told them 24 hours before. And then you're able to sign. And remember, you can sign in agreement or in disagreement, or partial agreement, partial disagreement. And what I mean by that is, if they are suggesting a one-on-one and you agree with that, you can sign that part in agreement. But let's say they're also suggesting to reduce his communication, his speech and language service, right? That you may want to sign in disagreement if you don't think that he's ready to lose that service. So you can sign accordingly, okay? Questions are collaborative, accusations are not, right? So this just speaks a little bit to any time that you're in an IEP meeting, we want to be collaborative with the school. We want to build a positive relationship. It doesn't mean I have to agree with everything they say, but it means that I can be courteous and I can be respectful. And one of the best strategies in disagreements is to ask questions, right? So are you telling me that my son cannot have communication because, right, whatever question, whatever you're trying to get at, try to practice framing what you want to say into a question, right? And that usually is more collaborative than the other, than combative or argumentative language or yelling, all of that. So these are some things to keep in mind. Lastly, on your presentation, you'll see some resources. I really want to highlight Disability Rights California here. Their website is wonderful. They have lots of information. Let me click that for you so you can take a look. If you go under Disability Rights California and you go under Resources, and you go under Special Education, then they have several resources here. A Special Education Basics Tool, Behavior and Discipline Toolkit, Disagreements with Districts, that might be a good one, Extended School Year, etc. It's got articles on students experiencing homelessness, emergency plans, etc. Transition services. It's a really great resource, okay? Then we have more resources here. And then here's the link to the Understood podcast that I mentioned at the beginning. Here is a link to that specific episode about what is an evaluation. And here's a link if you want to see that episode on YouTube instead of on the podcast. And then there are other podcasts. Inclusion Education Podcast is another one. And then if you just put a Google search for Special Education Podcast, you will land on this page. So I have simply given you the link to the page where I typed in Special Education Podcast, and all of these podcasts came out. So feel free to explore which one calls your attention, which one seems more helpful, and those are some resources for you. Okay. Thank you for coming today. This brings us to the end of our formal presentation. And now we will end this presentation and move on to more specific questions. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Sophia. That was amazing and so detailed as usual. There was one question in the chat,
Yes,
which said, I requested the IEP, but they told me I couldn't get it until I agreed with the IEP and was ready to sign it.
I requested the IEP, but they told me I couldn't get it until I agreed with the IEP and was ready to sign it. Okay, so I'm assuming this person's already in special education and they requested. Anytime that an IEP meeting is requested, they must hold it within 30 days. I was going to say they should not expect you to, but I will rephrase that and say it is against the law for them to do an IEP without you, and for them to have solved everything and for them to just ask you to sign it. So you should be part of the meeting of the IEP that is being created for you to sign. So in this question, then I also, it almost sounds like they might be in violation of that. There's no way for you to sign an IEP for which you haven't had a meeting for, right? So a suggestion would be request the IEP in writing, right? They have 30 days to hold it. And if they do not hold it within those 30 days, know that they are in violation, and you may consider filing a state compliance complaint because they have violated that. That state compliance complaint is sent to the California Department of Education. However, sometimes some parents choose to slip a copy of the complaint to the school so that they also know, hey, you're not complying with what the meeting in this example, I already filed the complaint. Sometimes that makes the district respond quicker, even though the complaint was already filed. And before the department comes and investigates, it's an incentive to move on it quickly, so that when the department comes and investigates, they say, oh, this complaint, oh, we already solved it, everything's good, right? So that's one strategy that some parents use. But overall, just to confirm your question there, they must give you an IEP within 30 days of you requesting it. Nothing, no strings attached per se, right? Not like you have to do this before we give you a meeting. There's none of that in the law. Okay.